Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Oceans, and congratulate him and the Department for bringing this important piece of legislation forward. As the Parliamentary Secretary stated earlier, Canada signed the port state measures in 2010. This is 2013. It's time to put into legislation ratification of our signature in 2010, and we really shouldn't delay any longer in that ratification. Because the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that illegal, unreported, unregulated, or IUU fishing is a serious problem around the world. It's one of the main impediments to the achievement of sustainable fisheries worldwide, and the estimated economic losses for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing averages between $10 billion and $23 billion per year. Most of that, Mr. Speaker, in economies that cannot afford it. Worse yet, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing affects these poorest countries, as I mentioned earlier. Their dependency on fisheries for food, livelihoods, and revenue is high compared to many other jurisdictions in the world. IUU fishing is not a problem for one country to solve on its own because it respects neither national or international borders. Where governance is weak and where countries fail to meet their international responsibility, it puts pressure on sustainability of fish stocks, marine wildlife, and distorts markets, not just in that specific region, but worldwide. In recent years, the international community has been working to develop global tools to prevent, deter, and eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing activities, improving the control of foreign fishing vessels through a global standard for actions that can be taken in ports is one tool to prevent illegal fishing. I'm proud to say that our government plays a leadership role in this movement. As a nation with a robust fishing industry, Canada has a strong interest in protecting fish stocks and ensuring that fishing regulations are respected. That's why we have taken action and have taken an international leadership role. In 2009, Canada and other countries approved the Port State Measures Agreement that have been negotiated at the Food and Agriculture Organizations of the United Nations. Canada signed this agreement in November of 2010 to signal the importance of taking strong actions in ports to prevent illegal fishing, and is now working towards ratifying these port state measures. So far, 20 countries have signed the treaty, 5 have ratified. The United States is currently dealing with its ratification legislation, and it is expected other countries will soon follow suit. Before Canada can ratify this new global standard, we must address gaps in our current legislation. These are the amendments we are discussing today in the Coastal Fisheries Protection Act. Once approved, the proposed amendments to the Act and the subsequent changes to the regulations would allow us to meet our international obligations, not to mention better protect the integrity of legitimate activities by Canadian fish harvesters. Within the existing Coastal Fisheries Protection Act and its regulations, Canada already has a robust port state control regime for foreign fishing vessels, and these amendments will make our regime even stronger. The proposed amendments can be grouped into 3 broad categories. The first concerns authorities related to fishing vessels. Currently, fishing vessels must apply for a license to enter Canadian fishing waters or to access our ports at least 30 days before they arrive. Under the proposed amendment, the Minister could allow a foreign vessel that has been directed by its flag state to enter a Canadian port even if it has not applied for a license. In this case, Canada would issue a specific permit for the sole purpose of inspection and enforcement. While the Port State Measures Agreement generally promotes refusal of entry to fishing vessels that have engaged in or supported illegal fishing, there might be situations where the flag state, that is, the country responsible for the fishing vessel, may want Canada's assistance to conduct an inspection and to gather evidence of a violation. These amendments will also give our Canadian protection officers greater authority to enforce the amended Coastal Fisheries Protection Act and the Port State Measures Agreement. When the vessel is directed to port under the new permit regime, these powers will allow Canadian protection officers, when they have reasonable grounds to suspect a vessel has been engaged in or supported illicit fishing activities, to inspect and search that foreign fishing vessel and to seize and dispose of illegal catch. In the absence of the consent of the flag state, however, a Canadian court could still authorize protection officers to dispose of any catch in accordance with international law. The second set of amendments revolves around information sharing. To meet the requirements of the Port State Measures Agreement, the amendments provide clarity on the authorities on the authorization to share information. The amendment covers both the type of information with whom it would be shared. First, the amendments clearly outline that the minister can share information regarding the inspection of a foreign vessel, the denial of entry to port of a foreign vessel, a change in a decision, an enforcement action taken, or the outcome of any proceedings related to a decision. Second, the amendments clarify that the minister can share this information with the flag state of the vessel, relevant coastal states, regional fisheries management organizations, states in whose fisheries the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing appears to have occurred, the state of nationality of the owner of the vessel, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and other relevant international organizations. As I have mentioned, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is a global threat to sustainable fisheries and to the management and conservation of fisheries resources and to marine biodiversity. The sharing of information is essential for all countries to work collectively to address this global threat. Third, amendments to the Act clarify that the minister can report actions that Canada has taken with respect to Canadian vessels that have engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing or fishing-related activities in support of such fishing. This information can be shared with other states party to the Port State Measures Agreement, relevant states, regional fisheries, management organizations, and the Food and Agriculture Organization. In addition, the proposed amendments would give certainty to the ability for Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Canadian Border Services Agency to share each other's information related to the import of fish and fish products. The third major category of amendments, Mr. Speaker, concerns prohibitions and related authorities. The proposed amendments would make it an offence to import illegal, unreported, and unregulated fish into Canada. The amendments would also give the authorities new tools to enforce these prohibitions. For example, the amendments would expand the powers of protection officers to inspect any place, including containers, warehouses, storage areas, and vehicles. Inspection could be conducted in all ports of entry. This is an important amendment since currently such powers are limited to seaports and wharves. They would also expand powers to allow for entry and search of these places with a warrant and, in certain circumstances, without a warrant. The Harper government is serious about controlling IUU fishing. The amendments would allow Canadian protection officers to seize illegal, unreported, and unregulated caught fish and fishing vessels. Mr. Speaker, vehicles or any other thing believed to be obtained or used in the commission of an offence under the Act could be seized. These foreign vessels would not only be seized if it is shown that they have been engaged in or supported illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Stiff fines can be imposed. A summary conviction would land a fine of up to $100,000. Conviction or indictment would cost vessels up to $500,000. And second convictions would garner up to double of the above fines. Mr. Speaker, I see that I'm running out of time. I realize I don't have time to finish all of my written text, but I would like to implore my colleagues across the way to support this important piece of legislation. We catch fish on the East Coast, the West Coast, and the high Arctic in Canada, and the inland fishery in Manitoba as well, all important to the local economies in those regions. Those fish simply don't stay in one spot. They swim across international boundaries, they swim across territorial boundaries, they swim across provincial boundaries. Mr. Speaker, we have one biomass of fish in the east coast of North America, one biomass on the west coast. They regularly are caught in international waters or in national waters on the Canadian side, and it's important that we have a regulatory regime that can address any illegal fishing of this important biomass and this important Canadian industry. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de...
Questions and comments, the honourable member for LaSalle-Mar. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask my colleague a question. Once again, we're looking at a bill, one that was introduced in the Senate. And when I am called upon to look at legislation of this, or bills of this type, I wonder, because the government was elected, has a majority, but only received 39% of the popular vote, so I can't really say that the majority of Canadians support the government, but at any rate, or supported the government. But that being said, here's my question. Once again, we're looking at a bill that was introduced first in the Senate by people who are appointed based on their services rendered to the Conservative Party for the most part. So why is the government proceeding this way, introducing the bills in the Senate first? And I'd like to hear the Parliamentary Secretary comment on that.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly tell the member opposite that this is an important piece of legislation. And I think it is, quite frankly, also important that it is introduced in the Senate. It makes the Senate more accountable and more realistic to all Canadians, Mr. Speaker. I'm always surprised by the opposition in the preambles to their statement and the lack of any real substance in it. What we have here is a specific problem that we're trying to address, and that's unregulated and unreported illegal fishing worldwide. This bill allows Fisheries and Oceans Canada, through the minister, to address that very real problem. The opposition want to take political cheap shots and make it something into what it isn't, then they can just go right ahead and do that, Mr. Speaker. That's their time, and if that's the way they choose to spend it on the floor of the House, instead of doing something about a very serious international problem, that's up to them.
Questions and comments, the honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we do recognize that IUU fishing is in fact something that is completely unacceptable, and I believe that all Canadians have a vested interest and are concerned about this issue, whether it's the pricing or the amount of harvesting that takes place and the depletion of fishing stocks by pirates that travel the world to with no sense of obligation of management control or maintaining certain species and so forth. It's deplorable. It's interesting that we have an agreement that was in fact signed in, I believe it was November 2010, I understand. Does the minister have a list of the signatories on that particular agreement, and does he have some thoughts on some countries that he would like to have seen sign onto the agreement?
The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
As I said in my speech, Mr. Speaker, the U.S. is in its ratification process right now. Certainly, we would expect all major fishing states to sign on to this agreement at some point. This prevents egregious international overharvesting and illegal fishing. And one only has to look at a couple of examples, Mr. Speaker. The Chilean sea bass is a very high value, very tasty, very high-end white tablecloth restaurant seafood that's been overfished in international waters by a number of countries and a number of, quite frankly, pirates around the world. There's been no international measure in place to deal with that. This allows the capacity for individual countries to deal with problems like that. Another great example, the Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Oceans mentioned it, and that's the International Tuna Agreement. We often catch tuna on the east coast of Canada that's been tagged in Portugal or tagged off the coast of Spain or off of North Africa. So we have an international fishery here in many, many species, and this is one way of addressing some of the problems with that international catch.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Newton North Delta.